Welcome back to the Vandy Sports Podcast. I'm Joey Dwyer here with my guy Brandon Bigsby. We're going to talk Vandy hoops today for the first time in a while. Vanderbilt's released its non-conference schedule. Brandon, I don't know if I've seen a non-conference schedule be released this far after a conference schedule, but I think in year one of Mark Bingington's tenure, it's been kind of difficult for him to get games and have leverage with these type of games. Teams don't really know what Vanderbilt's going to be with its style of play, with how much new personnel it has, and I think that's kind of reflected in its schedule, 7 bye games, and obviously, there's some challenges. You have Virginia Tech on the road, SEC, ACC Challenge. You got Cal at Memorial Gym, which I guess is probably their marquee home game, if you want to call it that, in the non-conference slate. They go to TCU, or they play at Dickies Arena, a neutral site game. TCU gets the neutral site bump in the net. Brandon, I'm going to hand it to you to read us the schedule, but initially, it doesn't look like the hardest schedule that they've had, but almost the cost of doing business nowadays, especially in year one. You've got to have at least a little bit of runway before you get to SEC play. You got to have something to help you out in the net, and it feels like Mark Bingington's done that.
Yeah, just a new way in scheduling with college basketball, it feels like, Joey. And I think we've kind of seen the positive and the negative with that. But you look at the schedule for Vanderbilt, you'll see a lot of them at Memorial Gym to start out. They start out November 4th against Maryland Eastern Shore. That's the first of a 4-game home stretch. On November 10th, it'll be Southeast Missouri. November 13th, you mentioned this game earlier, the marquee home game against Cal. That's going to be a lot of fun to watch. A familiar face in that one as well. Lee Dort coming back to Nashville. Right after that, they'll play against Jackson State on November 16th before heading off to Charleston for Charleston Classic. That'll be 3 games, November 21st through the 24th, and that's going to be a key schedule, or piece of the schedule to watch out for there as well. November 29th, they'll be back at home playing Tennessee Tech, and then 2 road games back-to-back at Virginia Tech, and then that neutral site game at Dickies Arena against TCU. That's the last time they'll play away from Nashville. 3 home games straight before they head into conference play. Citadel, December 18th. Austin Peay, December 21st, a bit of a break for Christmas, and then they play at home against New Orleans on December 30th. So you kind of mentioned it, a bit of some challenges probably for Mark Bingington to be able to get that schedule together because there are so many unknowns with this team, with the style of play. But nevertheless, not a bad schedule, I don't think, for the Doors Ball.
Yeah, I think Mark Bingington kind of leaned into the modern way of scheduling. I think he talked to me about this summer a little bit. Coaches want quad 1 games, and they want quad 4 games, and they want MTEs. That's all they want. Yeah. Nobody wants to play quad 2 or quad 3 games anymore if you're a Power 5 team. That kills the resume. And I think the previous staff made the mistake of going to places like VCU, and they're playing against teams like UNC Greensboro at home against Western Carolina. These mid-majors are teams they could completely beat up on, and I think that's a thing that the previous staff didn't pick up on. They needed to schedule teams that they could run off the floor and boost their net, and I think this team also has a little bit of a runway with the first 2 games. Maybe not as big as I would have thought. I thought they would have had 3 or 4 bye games to start. Cal's early. I wonder if there was some that fell through between the 4th and the 10th. But it looks interesting to me just because there's 7 bye games. And last year we talked about the bye games as, man, I don't know if they're going to beat UNC Greensboro. I don't know if they're going to beat Western Carolina. This year, it's a matter of how much are they going to beat these teams by. It would be stunning if they lost to one of those teams. And I don't know that we've been able to say that the last couple of years with the teams they've scheduled. Maryland Eastern Shore is probably going to be 300 plus in the net. Same with SEMO. Same with Jackson State. Same with Tennessee Tech, who that's the first game or the only game today that hadn't been previously reported. Citadel, Austin Peay, New Orleans, all teams that are going to be probably 250 or above in the net in Ken Palm. And I think that's the blueprint you've got to have with bye games now. And also, I like for their net that they're going to Virginia Tech and they're playing TCU at a neutral. I don't know that they originally had thought they were going to play TCU at a neutral, but I think that also doesn't kill them very much. I think that could still very well be a quad 1 game. The only one on the schedule that I don't think fits into either of those or any of the 3 criteria I said was Cal, and I think they needed some home game to get people to come to Memorial earlier in the year. And that's not a huge marquee game, but I think with Lee Dort returning and them being an ACC team, that's a game that people are going to be drawn to, and that's going to be a big litmus test for them.
Yeah, I think that Cal game, out of all of the games on the schedule, I think that's the one that's most intriguing to me for a lot of those reasons. And I agree, it's a little bit surprising, I think, to see them have that much of a marquee matchup in just game 3, especially at home. But you have to remember, early on in the season, California going out to make the travel all the way from Berkeley to Nashville. And again, totally different staff, totally different play style, totally different roster. So there's not going to really be a whole lot on film for Vanderbilt compared to California. So as much as it is kind of an odd place in the schedule, you feel like maybe there's some advantages built in for Vandy, considering they are at home. It's a long travel for California, and not only that, but again, all of those unknowns. There's not going to be a whole lot of film that you can really scout on with this group, particularly with it being so early on.
Yeah, that's a test for them, and I think one that they should pass if all goes according to plan. I wonder if they have enough tests, because Charleston, they're going to play, I think, Nevada to start. Then they got Seton Hall and VCU. That's probably going to be their toughest game to that point. And then after that, I'm not sure what they've got. If they win, they'll probably play one of the better teams in the field. There's a test, and I do think people look at the schedule and just say cupcakes galore, things along those lines. I think the MTE not listing the games is doing kind of a disservice to what they're actually playing. But I do wonder, is there enough there? And I do think there probably is, with them playing at a neutral against TCU, which is basically an away game. Them playing Virginia Tech on the road, that's probably going to be a packed house. Tyler Nickel and MJ Collins making their return. Tyler Nickel talked to us this offseason and was talking about how he wants that to kind of be a revenge game of sorts. Charleston, I think, is going to give him some challenges. So is Cal. So you're looking at it, and they're probably going to play 4 or 5 Power 5 games. I think that's probably enough. Like I said, though, you're looking at two complete opposite ends of the spectrum. At least ideally for Vanderbilt, you're going to play quad 1 teams, you're going to play quad 4 teams. And I think it's valuable that you have a coach now that gets that and gets that that's what you need to do to manipulate the net and manipulate KenPom. You got to run it up and cover the spread against bad teams, and you got to go test yourself against good teams early. And I think playing all these teams that can kind of help to boost your net and boost your resume early is going to help, because this team is certainly going to have a learning curve. They're a bunch of old guys. None of them really played together, though, and it's a new scheme. It's a scheme where I think you get better as the year goes, just because of all the instinctual stuff. They're putting in a lot of concepts rather than straight up sets, so it's going to take a while for it to really fully flesh out in game action. So I like that they're playing so many bye games that are not going to be games you're looking at as about this team's sneaky, they're going to come in and beat you. Last year we were talking about, man, UNCG is way better than people think. Western Carolina's way better than people think. There's probably a couple others that I'm forgetting. But I kind of like the blueprint here by Mark Bingington. And I, more so than anything, I like that he gets kind of what this has to be about, which I don't think the previous staff did.
Yeah, and I'd have to agree with you. And I feel like that's something that, as this new system, ever since the net was implemented, is such a massive part, replacing the old RPI system. Scheduling has been something that so many staffs and so many coaches have really kind of caught on how to really put the system at their advantage. And I feel like with the previous staff, they were kind of stuck in that old way that would benefit the RPI of, oh, if we play these quad 2, quad 3 teams, these high-end mid-majors, if we go on the road and play them, or if we bring them here, we'll get the benefit of the doubt for having this really tough strength of schedule. But that just isn't the way of things anymore. Having to play a team like a VCU or someone like that just doesn't give you that same boost winning compared to the knock that it takes against you if you lose that game. And again, you talk about bye games. The biggest problem is that even with the bye games that were there, they were closely contested. You can't play Presbyterian and lose by 10. You can't play Central Arkansas or USC Upstate and only win by a score.
And why are you playing San Francisco?
Exactly. So it's just the strategicness of scheduling feels like it wasn't crafted for the way that this system is to get yourselves into the tournament. And ultimately, that's what cost Vanderbilt a tournament spot 2 years ago, was those early losses in non-con, losing to teams like Grambling, playing against VCU on the road and losing. Things like that. That was the difference. So to see this new staff seemingly have that understanding of, okay, this is what we need to do to have our net ranking where it is. It's not necessarily just about strength of schedule. You have the SEC that is as stacked as can be that will help with that. Let's focus on getting those bye games, those quad 4s, sprinkling some quad 1s in there, teams like Cal, teams like Virginia Tech, like TCU, and then those Charleston Classic games. It feels like there's a really well-crafted balance to where Vanderbilt can come out with a good record, have some of those bye games, but also have some opportunities to boost that resume as well.
Yeah, the one puzzling thing to me when you look at the schedule is the first 3 games. Obviously, you got a little runway with the first 2. Like I said earlier, I thought they might have a little more, especially with the A.J. Hogarth thing, which I think is kind of the elephant in the room here. They've suspended guys. There's precedent for it, for them suspending guys. 3 games for playing in the Portsmouth. A.J. Hogarth did that this offseason, and their 3rd game is against a Power 4 team. So I'm kind of interested to see if they think there's optimism that maybe they can get out of that, because I think I've heard a little bit this offseason about maybe there being optimism that the precedent doesn't kind of hold up this year, and I wonder if maybe that's an indicator that that doesn't happen. If not, some guys are going to have to rise to the occasion against Cal, and I think it's too early to kind of preview that game, but I wonder if them scheduling that game the way they did and not scheduling another bye game before it so that you have 3 to start, I wonder if that's an indicator that they feel good about the AJ Hoggard thing. And I don't know that we have much intel on that at this point, but it is an interesting kind of dynamic and interesting thing to consider when you look at the schedule. Because I was totally expecting, I knew all the teams going in, didn't know the dates. I was totally expecting it to be 3 quad 4 games to start it out, and they kind of get in a rhythm, which they're going to be able to do in the first 2 games. AJ Hoggard is a guy that's got to play for them, though. And if you're playing one of your biggest non-conference tests in your marquee home game without him, it's an interesting thought for me.
Yeah, and I agree with you. There's actually a team kind of similar to Vanderbilt in some ways in Villanova that did that exact same thing. If you saw their non-conference schedule, they scheduled their first 2 days of the season. They played 2 games back-to-back against the weakest teams they could have possibly found, and then had another game a few days after that just so they could get one of their starters back because he played in the Portsmouth just in case he got that 3-game suspension. So I am kind of surprised at that, and you mentioned something earlier that I do wonder about. It makes you wonder if maybe one of those games fell through. Maybe Cal was still on the schedule. Typically, a game like that, it's been in the works for a while, but there is a part of me that wonders that maybe between the 4th and the 10th, if there was possibly a game in there that fell through. Not totally sure on that, just pure speculation, but if Hoggard does end up having to sit that 3rd game because of the Portsmouth and they play California, that's going to be a very interesting dynamic because, again, obviously you have Edwards there, he's going to be able to do his thing, but who's going to be able to step up and be that second guard? And you figure it'll probably be a guy like a Nickel or someone like that, but then again, you also have to consider depth. Depth does have a big key on that as well, so if you lose Hoggard, other guys have to be placed up. Then you're looking at maybe Tyler Tanner having to play critical minutes really early in his career, or Karis Bilal. So I think there's a lot of possibilities. There's been an announcement on the AJ Hoggard thing yet, so it does kind of give an indication. Maybe Vanderbilt's confident that they'll have him for that game. If they do, I think they have to feel a lot better about their chances with him compared to without him. But nevertheless, I do think that for so many reasons, that Cal game is important, and I think that that's the game that I'm really interested to see how they look, especially if they do or don't have AJ Hoggard in the lineup that night.
Yeah, the buzz is going to be something different if they go and beat Cal that night, and it's a little early to talk about that, but I think the biggest thing for them in non-conference play is you got to blow out the mid-majors, right? And it's not mid-majors like they played before. We're mid-major guys. So we're not saying Vanderbilt is like way above every mid-major. We're saying that they're way above these mid-majors, or at least should be. And they've got to prove that throughout non-conference play. Maybe bigger than all, they've got to mesh, and they've got to get going by the time they start SEC play. They're going to start it right at the beginning of January, and I think this non-conference play specifically with pretty much every guy being new to the system except Jaylen Carey and Holman Smith, I just think maybe the most important thing, rather than going and beating Virginia Tech or beating TCU, is you've got to be a cohesive unit, and you've got to learn how to win by then. You've got to learn how to play with each other, and you've got to have some confidence going into SEC play. I think it's really important that they at least win 9 or 10 games in this, just to put themselves in position, because the SEC is going to be really hard, and they've got to have a high net coming out of it, and they've also got to have 1 or 2 wins on their resume that makes you think and makes you encouraged about what they have. But Brandon, I think maybe the biggest thing is just the makeup of this team once we get out of December. And I think that's maybe what I'm most curious to see at this point.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a good point. The margin of victory with those bye games is going to be such an important thing to look out for. And I know we've talked about the previous staff a little bit and their propensity of scheduling these really tough quad 2 and quad 3 games, but something else that was a trend with those teams the last few years is that when they had those bye games come in, they were not convincing at all. I mean, that Grambling game a couple of years ago, that's the one that sticks out to me the most. A team that is the team in the SWAC. Ironically, Vanderbilt has another SWAC team on the schedule in Jackson State. Grambling came in and beat Vanderbilt that game, and I think that most people would probably agree that if Vanderbilt, instead of losing by 5 or 6, wins that game by 20, they're probably in the tournament that year with how they finished down the stretch, even without Liam Robbins. And the last few years, that's kind of been the one trend, is that they'll schedule some of those bye games, but even those games haven't been convincing. You can't just go in there and kind of sleepwalk and only win by 8. You got to win by at least 20 plus, I feel like, in a lot of these games. And you just look at some of the teams and some of the conferences they come from. I mean, You see a couple of OVC teams. The OVC, not particularly a strong conference typically in terms of the mid-major. You see some SWAC teams in there. It's just one of those things to where you have to be able to take care of business in those games. You can't sleep well through those, and you might even see one of these teams sneak into the tournament. Like Austin P, for example, they're on the schedule. They were 3 points away from making the tournament last year in the A-Sun. We got to look at them up close and personal, covering for Lipscomb.
And they've got a lot of turnover too, which is I think why they were attracted to them rather than a team like Lipscomb or MTSU.
Yeah, and then same with a team like Tennessee Tech. Made a run a couple of years ago, but when you compared them to Vanderbilt, Vanderbilt is significantly better than that team. So winning those games, and not just winning them, but winning them in convincing fashion where you don't leave much doubt about it, that's going to be the massive key, I think, for the schedule, even outside of those big conference games, like your outer conference games like you mentioned.
Right. I think, they play 13 games?
Yes.
You probably got to go 10-3 to really love where you're at coming out of it. You can afford a loss at Virginia Tech, right? If they win that game, that is a huge, huge win for them. If they win at TCU or at Dickies Arena, basically at TCU, that's a huge thing. But I think you can afford to lose those two. You can probably afford to lose 1 or 2 in Charleston. You've probably got to be at least around the 10-win mark and probably playing your best basketball coming out of December, though. And that's probably what I'm looking for more so than anything. I think they've got to win big against the mid-majors, and they've got to get at least 1 or 2 wins that kind of get people to look at it and say, well, maybe they've got something here. That's really my expectation for them, and my expectation is that Mark Bingington will have them in shape by January.
Yeah, and you have to remember, too, that the strength of schedule with how the SEC is going to help Vanderbilt out a lot. So if you end up going, say, 11-2 in non-conference play, you look really good. You have 11 wins in the bank. You have a ton of opportunities to get those high-quality wins in conference, especially when you consider that this is now a conference that adds Texas and Oklahoma, 2 teams that typically make the tournament more times than not. So I think, like you said, 10-3 is where you probably need to be to really feel good about where you're at. I think you can drop Virginia Tech. I think you can drop TCU. The Charleston Classic, I think, is the big one because those are going to be 3 games back to back to back. Can they steal at least 1 or 2 of those? I think that's going to be the interesting one, especially against a team like Seton Hall that we just saw won the NIT last year. So that's going to be really interesting. That Charleston Classic game, or that little stretch, I think is the one where we could really see Vanderbilt's non-conference outlook swing either very positively or maybe a little bit more negatively to where you're saying, okay, instead of being 11-2, Vanderbilt ended up being, we'll say, 9-4, 8-5. You're like, okay, they're going to have a really strong conference schedule to realistically have themselves get into the tournament.
Yeah, I think this is not the hardest schedule that Mark Bingington could have built, but I think it was optimal for where they were at, especially with kind of some of the constraints that I felt like he had in terms of scheduling and things along those lines. It's harder to schedule than ever, especially as a first-year guy. He talked about, and James Madison, it was even more difficult, so I wonder if it was a relief for him in some senses, but I think a relief for him was getting his first 2025 commit. Jaylen Dean Vines put the Rapid reaction up yesterday. Wanted to touch on it a little more, get Brandon's input. Obviously, a really tremendous athlete, a guy who can really play out of ball screens. I think he's probably more of a 2-3 than a 1-2, but I like what he's got. I think there's a lot of growing to do. I think he could play early on if everything goes to plan with him, with the athleticism and everything, but I think you're probably more likely to see a red shirt at this point in his development, and that's not to say that can't change, because I think a lot of the time if the plan's to redshirt, then you look forward and eventually it's not. But I just love the downhill ability, and I think the jumper is fluid enough to where you can see him be an improved shooter as well.
Yeah, and I feel like you hear this expression a lot from coaches with players that have a lot of potential. He's almost like a moldable ball of clay almost, I feel like, for Mark Bingington. And for this to be Bingington's first get, I think is really, really fun, because you have a guy that's 6'3". Like you said, I think he's more of a 2-3. I don't really know how comfortable they feel with him necessarily running the offense and having the offense facilitate through him. But he's a guy that can run, he can jump out the gym, 6'3", has decent enough size. If he can put all of those tools together with the athleticism, the fundamentals, the ball handling, the shooting consistently, you feel like this staff has a guy that can be really special for them in 2 or 3 years. And even if it's not someone that's giving you Jason Edwards numbers necessarily, you still have a guy, I think, that can come in and contribute and give you 20 minutes a game at worst. So I think that they really like the potential that they can develop with him. He's a guy that can come in, learn. There's not that pressure for him to eat up minutes right away, because I think that this team has that depth. They're pretty stacked at the guard position. So he's not going to have to come in and play 15 to 20 important minutes the minute that he steps in on campus. He kind of has that time to really learn, grow, make those mistakes, and just kind of grow into that potential and grow into that talent. So for this to be commit number one for Mark Bingington and the staff, I think this is a really exciting one. I mean, a 3-star recruit as well. Somebody had interest from a few really big programs. So I'm interested with it. I like it a lot.
Yeah, I almost think of it like I think of MJ Collins in a sense.
Yeah.
A guy who's really athletic, who you always think has more in the tank. And that's what I think of MJ Collins. I've heard good things about him this summer. I've heard that they really, really like him. They like his positional versatility. They like what he can do off the bounce. I think we're going to hear that about Jaylen Vines. I don't know that he's going to be a guy with as much versatility as MJ Collins. I don't know that his offensive game is as developed as MJ Collins, but he's also younger. And I think beating out a team like Louisville and Texas A&M and West Virginia and Washington in your first recruiting battle for a high schooler, pretty dang good sign. I think we talked about it a lot this offseason, but we're finally starting to find some proof of concept that they're recruiting at a higher level than I think Vanderbilt basketball has for a long time. And this was a microcosm of that, and if they can go get a Lennon Jemison who's got an offer from Kansas and is being heavily recruited by Kansas, they can go to get a Cam Ward who's got all types of high major suitors, a Derek Dixon who's got UNC and Arizona after him. I mean, they got a chance, Brandon, to really put together a good class. I do wonder if it's going to take 1 year of consistent production on the court for them to be able to sell to these guys more consistently, but I like what they're doing right now, and I think they've got a staff of tireless recruiters, and I think they have an interesting approach to where they're kind of putting 2 guys on each guy. I talked to Simon Walker a couple weeks ago, another guy that they're in the mix for. Rick Ray and Matt Buckland, I think, are in pretty consistent contact, as is probably Mark Bingington. So they're kind of throwing everything at these guys, and Eric Musselman was such a great recruiter at Arkansas because he had the whole staff reaching out. I think Mark Bingington understands that you've got to do it by committee more so than just this guy gets the Northeast, this guy gets the South, things along those lines. You got to contact the agents, you got to contact the high school coaches, the AAU coaches, and I think they have a pretty firm grasp of that right now, and that's really what's made me optimistic about what they can do on the trail.
Yeah, especially with just this new wave of college basketball and just the come up in the pipeline that goes through it. I mean, you weren't talking about agents and AAU and all these different things 15 years ago. The game of recruiting has changed so drastically. And Mark Bingington, being a younger coach, having a younger staff, he understands that. He's able to grasp that, and I think that he takes on that challenge. I still go back to that opening presser. He said it. I think Vanderbilt should be an easy sell. It's the #1 conference in the country, one of the best educations in the country, and one of the best cities in the country. And so far, he's selling pretty darn well, Joey. I mean, you mentioned some of those names. I can't remember the last time that Vanderbilt has been consistently in top 8, top 5 lists and getting visits from top 100 recruits at such a consistent rating. I think that we saw some potential of that from the previous staff. I mean, one of the biggest guys they were going for was Carr, who ended up going to Michigan State. They were in his final 3, but we ended up seeing Lee Dort, Noah Shelby, those guys come in who were not bad recruits at the time, but just did not really pan out, didn't have a lot of that same, I guess, attention, so to speak, from a lot of these high-end, high-power programs. So for Vanderbilt to be where they are, year 1, new coach, new system, a rebuild, for them to be able to get guys that are 3 stars and have so much potential, for them to be in the conversation for so many guys the way they are, really promising, I think, about where this program can go. And that's not even considering the fact that, like you said, the season hasn't started yet. If Vanderbilt comes in, gets 20 wins this year, you can visibly see the trajectory going up. Recruits pay attention to that as well. So I think that this is a really good sign about the direction that the program is going in and how they're choosing to recruit guys and trying to get them on campus.
Yeah, well, we'll see how it comes to fruition in that non-conference slate, but right now, I think we've got a lot of good things to say about the program. Mark Bingington is talking tomorrow, as are a few players. I'll be there. I don't know if Brandon can get out of his classes, but we'll see how that goes. If so, we'll have some sort of rapid reaction after. We might have one, regardless of whether Brandon can go or not. But looking forward to covering basketball more. I think we're trying to really hone in on football with kind of how it's gone, but we're going to really hit basketball hard soon, especially once we get deeper into football season. So, Brandon, thanks for coming on, and we'll do it again soon.
Yeah, can't wait. Basketball's almost here, man. We're so close. I'm loving the football stuff, though, so always nice to get some basketball in there, too, especially with so much going on right now.
Always nice, Brandon. We'll see you tomorrow.